Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. Behavior analysis is a science of behavior. And Doug Kostewicz.
Focus on the individual, and you're going to see focus on behavior.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everyone and welcome back to ABA On Call. Doug, I am excited about not just seeing you, but talking about our topic today.
It is so very exciting. We get to do a review of another article. And don't keep everyone in suspense. Tell them what the article is.
We occasionally will do reviews. And this article is called What is Wrong with Daily Life in the Western World? And for those of you who haven't read a lot of Skinner, Skinner started off his career as an experimental scientist, way back in the 30s. I mean, when you think that it sounds like it's really old, even though we're a young science. From our perspective, that's a long time ago. And Skinner just spent a lot of time working to establish the science, and then it just started blossoming. It started growing. More and more people did it. And as Skinner grew later in his career, he started saying, how does this apply to people? And he wrote a number of papers, and this was published in, 86, I think was the year. So this was 4 years before he died. And he's written some books, but certainly at the end of his career, he was just talking about these very weighty issues. And this particular article, just as its name speaks, is he was talking about what's wrong with life in the West. And when we talk about the West, what we mean here is not just, the Western side of the United States. We're talking about the Western world. So, Europe, North America, Australia, those kinds of areas. And not just the areas, but also the cultural practices that have come up. And this article, Doug, he lays out a number of problems. We're just going to talk about 3. And the first one, now that I've laid the background for everyone, is he talks about help. What does he mean here when Skinner's talking about help? What's the problem in the Western world with help?
So it's if we could encapsulate it, it's basically doing things for other people that they don't have to do for themselves. And that is a problem on so many levels when we think about this behaviorally. When you do something for someone, it helps them to avoid something negative, some negative contingency or aversive condition, but it also prevents that person from interacting with certain contingencies that can then meet with reinforcement.
Yeah, that's a nice summary. Skinner writes, consider the extent to which labor-saving devices have made us button pushers. I love that. We push buttons on elevators, telephones, dashboards, video recorders, washing machines, ovens, typewriters, and computers, all in exchange for actions that would at least have had a bit of variety. And he's absolutely right. We certainly are button pushers. And when this is I think the background that when I think about what Skinner is saying here, he is really explaining where we are And he's talking about how some of these things have been problems and have alienated us from some of the consequences that we have. Everyone is so excited about technology and robots and all these things, but what happens when all of a sudden robots are doing everything? Where does that leave us as people? And we are behavior analysts, so how is that going to affect us as a species as we continue to create these labor-saving devices? What effect is that going to have on us as a species?
Well, I'll step in the, and now you being in education, you'll notice this. It's not even just thinking that big. I would even argue, let's go down to our children and how many parents do things for them, prevent that adverse consequence, helicopter in to save them. Well, that denies those individuals, those kids, and I'm not above some of that stuff. You don't want bad things to happen to people you love. However, that mentality, that way of handling situations denies those individuals potentially life-saving, life-altering contingencies at the individual level. Where you're going is sort of an overall push of the species. Where will we be? What behaviors are being reinforced?
Yeah.
So, and that's a dangerous path that we're taking. And oh, you failed to mention this, Rick. This wasn't written 2 years ago. This was written 40 years ago. And if we could take a quick snapshot, I don't think things have changed that much.
Yeah. I can't argue. And the point that you made about students. Skinner uses the term, well, he talks about applies to not just young children, to students, to people with disabilities, to older, people who are older, like senior citizens. And like we know for a fact that the more things we do, the more help we give, that can really negatively impact people. I'll never forget reading an article. This was in graduate school, and it was early on talking about, and I'm going to paraphrase the results. And now, who knows if I even have all the details right? It's been so long. But the gist of it was, someone was trying to teach brushing teeth, and the clients or the people who they were working with had real bad ataxia and had a hard time gripping things. So there was a tendency to just do it for them, go in and help them. And this article talked about even if you put it in their hand and they have some control, the satisfaction in like the behavioral problems that were occurring around the teeth brushing, all of it dropped. And that's the thing with help. Is help something that can be done, either another person doing it or machines are doing it, or whatever way that manifests itself? How positive of a thing is that, and where is that going to go as we continue to grow as a species?
Well, if it doesn't change, what's going to happen is different behaviors will come to the forefront as being selected in by those contingencies. So you think about just what we interacted with years and years ago, Rick, because we're not young.
Speak for yourself.
And then what the kids did. Oh, that's true. I'm sorry. Think about what we interacted with and how did we get those behaviors that are perhaps fluent, perhaps we've done a good job with them, perhaps get us in and out of situations. And do the kids today, do the younger generations have those skills established? Are the contingencies even present anymore? And it's a change. It's not, and this is probably, technology is one of the big problems over time. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it puts us in a weird spot because you want to help, but sometimes it's important to interact with aversive consequences so that you know what not to try in the future and to try something else.
Jumping off of what you said, both you and I learned manuscript and we learned cursive. People aren't teaching cursive anymore. What happens when we move to the place where the text or the speech to text is already incredibly powerful, but is there going to be a day where we don't teach kids to spell anymore? We don't. All we do really is teach reading and no writing, and everything is said. I mean, that's not too far fetched. We're not talking science fiction here. You can look at the more devices we have that help us. It's going to impact us in all kinds of ways. And the question is it going to be beneficial for us, or is it?
Well, that brings us to our first word, Mr. Rick, and that is help. Well, Rick, that brings us to our second topic within the group of kind of downfalls in the Western world, and it's an interesting one because it's advice. And if you could sort of define that for the audience, that'd be great. So what does Skinner talk about when he means advice?
Advice, imagine advice as, well, just what it sounds like. Maybe around rule-governed behavior, if you can think about what that is. If someone gives you a rule and you follow it and these particular reinforcing consequences happen, then you are more likely to follow that kind of advice in the future. However, there's also advice out there that can be given from other sources where they may have very long delayed, long acting consequences, like smoking. Hey, don't smoke, because we have science who's giving advice and saying, if you smoke, you have a greater probability of getting lung cancer. Well, that's not like it's happening tomorrow. So Skinner is talking about, when he talks about advice, he's questioning, we turn the dial back to our, the evolutionary time clock. We weren't giving each other advice. We were very much contingency shaped. And during that time, the world was very different. So Skinner, when he talks about advice, that's what he's getting at.
And as he said, it's a problem, right?
I think it can be a problem.
No, it can be a problem, but it also comes with who's giving the advice, what the advice is. And if you're run totally on rule-governed behavior, then you, again, as an individual, are not interacting with the contingencies that are shaping behavior. That's not to say advice of, hey, don't go down that dark alley isn't something we should wouldn't follow. But if you're constantly telling someone, hey, I think it's a good idea to take this job, don't do that. If it's a good idea to follow this career path, don't do this. Or drive this type of car, don't drive. So you can see how this can remove the individual from becoming overly reliant on any type of advice because they haven't been able to interact with the contingencies that put them there.
That's a good clarification. Skinner, he, in these articles, what I think would have been a great article to review before this is, Skinner wrote an article in Science. I can't remember if it was the 50s or 60s, but he talked about 3 kinds of reinforcement or selection. Selections of survival, selections of reinforcement, and selections of culture, or contingency. I should say contingencies of survival, contingencies of. And what that gets at is, if you look at the first one, you're talking about natural selection, our phylogeny. The second one is the reinforcement. This is the thing and all the contingencies that Skinner spent so many years talking about. And then the last one is, now we have these cultural practices ever since our verbal behavior came under opera control, now we can have things like a culture. We can have things like a vice. And this article is sitting back and looking at that. And so, when I was listening to you talk about, those different kinds of ways, it all gets at what do we lose when we avoid the strengthening effects of reinforcement and instead are just relying on advice? What are the positives? What are the negatives?
And you see why this comes up a lot is because the people that give advice are under the contingencies to give advice.
Yeah.
Right? So parents advising their child have the best interest, just like with help, right? We want to tell them to do things because we don't want bad things to happen. Companies and corporations provide advice because they want to make money on the decisions and the behaviors that you make. So there's the contingencies for the others to provide advice is highly reinforcing, and then it comes down to the individual's history with advice. So yeah, it's really a mismatch. It's so when you sit and think about it, it's like, wow, I'm not going to listen to any more of your advice. That's all I know.
Skinner wrote this in '86, and back then, that was the dawning of the age of the internet. Maybe AOL happened a little bit after that, and Prodigy, and these other very early services. Now look where we are. You can't open up your computer without being blasted with advice. And the advice that's coming is coming from all sorts of different areas. And Skinner didn't see where we are now in society. And when I think about how our kids are, I have a granddaughter. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but I think about the world she's going to grow up in, and it's different from the world I grew up in. She will be inundated with these tech companies that are tracking everything and trying to give her advice to do all sorts of things, advice to buy things, advice to behave in certain ways. And frankly, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, these big tech companies don't necessarily have her best interests at heart. And so when Skinner wrote this, I wonder, were he alive today, what would he be saying? I think most of this would probably be talking about the internet and tech and where it's going.
Well, and interesting you say, because there was advice when you were a kid, but you had probably a lot less of it and more. You have an established repertoire. You've had this history of reinforcement that now when you're inundated with advice, you can step back and be a better consumer of that advice. When with kids now today, they don't have that same history. And so we really can see why it's so simple. I know this is going to sound really bad. It's so simple for certain ways, advice to get inundated and stories to appear and get support and then move forward and acting like it's truth.
Yeah. Think of if we consider there are institutions that thrive on giving advice. And some of these institutions, they want to make money, they want to survive as a practice, and the advice that they are giving sometimes can be incredibly damaging. And some of the things that they're saying, this gets down to perhaps a particular order. Maybe there's someone from a particular group that is preaching hate against other people for whatever reason. You fill in the reason. I don't have to. We have enough of it all around us. In the advice that they give, what Skinner, his point at the end of this, he has these nice summaries at the end of the article, and he's saying, look, we're taking advice because of the consequences that follow in these given instances, not because of the consequences that follow in the past. And acting towards people in a certain way because of advice versus the contingency shaped can have a really negative effect. And I think that, what Skinner is saying here is very relevant. And I think about so much hate speech, and not just the hate speech, but hey, let's act this particular way to these folks, and that's just based off of advice from this group over here, and that can have just incredibly terrible effects.
Well, I want to say one thing. You made me think of it. So there's all this advice that then you've surrounded yourself with people or entities that when you do behave to follow that advice, it's not the world that provides those contingencies. It's this group of people that in turn start to quickly provide reinforcements and strengthen the behaviors based on advice, not the general world, or if left to their own devices would that get. So you hear these echo chambers on the internet where you get this bad advice, but you're around 2,000 people that are really staunch proponents of that bad advice. When you do it, you start to get shaped up really quick, and boom. Yeah, so it establishes some really not so great behaviors in your repertoire.
Well, Doug, you brought us to our second secret word. Boy, say that fast really quickly, which is advice. This will bring us to the third part that we're going to talk about in Skinner's article, and that is pleasure. Now, Skinner talks about, well, he uses pleasures. He makes this plural. What's Skinner mean when he talks about pleasures? What's the problem with that?
So this one kind of, rereading this again kind of reminded me, it struck me, and this was just one of those, wow. So he's talking about just, we seek out the things that make us feel good, that are very awesome and feel pleasurable. But the understanding that just because something feels good and pleasurable and reinforcing doesn't mean it's necessarily reaching the strengthening aspect for certain behaviors. So if we were to take a very simple example of watching a movie, that can be highly pleasurable. I mean, we watch movies. Well, a lot of people that like movies watch movies or watch TV shows. Well, the behaviors that are getting reinforced are simply hitting power and looking at the screen. So if you think about what behaviors are being established by doing all these pleasurable activities, it ain't much happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point. I thought you were going to break into some Tony. Feels good.
Oh, do it again?
Do a little dance.
Yeah, oh, feels good. Okay.
All right, we're really dating ourselves, but hey, it's okay.
That's all right.
I felt a little guilty when I was reading this because all of us, we live in the Western world. We all, these pleasures, if you engage in them, you can have great time sucks. I mean, Skinner happened to talk about gambling, and I have been known to throw the dice in my time, and I like that pleasure. But really, what am I doing? If I look at myself behaviorally and I say, okay, I'm gambling, what is the pleasing effect that I'm getting? These establishments are all designed to take my money and take everybody's money, not just me. And thinking about that more rationally versus just looking at the pleasing effects can help you, have an insight into your own behavior and decide, are many of the things that you're doing on the pleasure side, are they really worth it? Or, could there be other things that you're doing? Skinner also talks about eating, and some people are just eating food because it tastes good. Now, I'll never forget when I was a high schooler, one of my history professors, his name was Mr. Beck, and I'll never forget, he had this famous phrase, and he would say, "You eat to live, you don't live to eat." He's talking about the Romans, and that's wisdom, and that all of that has just made me think a lot on just this section when Skinner's talking about pleasures and how that can have just a really negative effect on people.
Well, what was really cool, and he hit this directly, but so yeah, you can see a problem with gambling, you can see a problem with overeating, but he doesn't limit it to these sort of negative what the when you go to the museum, what do? It's pleasurable to look
Yeah.
at pictures, but what behaviors are you engaging when you listen to classical music? You just listening, and it's pleasurable, but the behaviors that get reinforced aren't necessarily what you think they are. You don't get better at painting because you go to museums and just stare at pictures. You don't get better at playing a violin or watching football, because if we did, about 75 billion people a year would be NFL players. But it's pleasurable to watch these things, but it's so easy when it's available. So it's almost that reinforcing contingency really weakens our overall behavioral repertoire.
Yeah.
And it stinks. Although when we had that talk about hobbies and things that we like, it was interesting, and I'll bring this up though because I think it's pertinent, and I'm just going to do it anyway because I'm still talking. But we said, when we talked about expanding our repertoire within the hobby, you kind of have to do things that are more difficult to get better at them. That's not that same pleasurable aspect. You're almost taking a more active role. So you're learning, perhaps making spreadsheets to get your comic collection or magic collection together. So you're not just engaging with that pleasurable aspect. So you can do pleasurable things that establish other behaviors within your repertoire because it's the extension, but fooling yourself to believe that you are doing anything more and strengthening anything more than just doing it, like when you look at TV, that's not the case.
When Skinner wrote this article, he made some points. In Skinner, for those people who haven't read a lot, like I've read so much of his work in graduate school and then through my time and career, we have to remember that he was just another person like us. He was the founder of this science of contemporary behavior analysis, and he was also a product of his own contingencies. And you maybe have read Walden 2, and some people react negatively to that book, but that was just Skinner's fictional approach, and he was saying these are things that could be. He wasn't saying that's have to be that way. And towards the end of this, Skinner points out that in this article, the quality of life in the West isn't the most important problem in the world today. If we look at poverty, global poverty, illness, violence, overpopulation, the destruction of the environment. Right now, as we're talking about this, there happens to be a terrible situation going on in Ukraine. So it's these things are happening, and they're having very, very significant effects to. And just because things are happening over here doesn't mean they're not going to end up happening here. And Skinner talks about solutions that are based off of scientific principles, and that's what I find very encouraging. And this is an article, so Skinner wasn't setting out to solve all of the problems of all of these areas. That would require a little more than a 6 or 7 page article in American Psychologist. That we're talking about books. Any one of those areas you could write a book on. You could just spend so much time on it. But what I've appreciated is the way Skinner defines this in generally looking at through the lens of behavior analysis, understanding what these different contingencies of survival, contingencies of selection, reinforcement, and contingencies of the cultural selection, how important they are, and how ultimately we can use those to help fix these problems.
And I think that there are people that in non-behavioral terms are concerned about these things. And we could, I mean, I've heard many people who aren't behavior analysts tell parents, hey, don't coddle your kids, let them experience life. Well, that is a direct attack on the advice situation or the help situation. So, I mean, it's people recognize that these are problems. We work within them. This aren't to say it's the be-all, end-all, but it really, when you read this article, it really kind of solidifies some things and makes you think about it from a different, as you said, more scientific angle, especially within the lens of behavior analysis, that very poignant.
Yeah. Secret word number 3, West.
Well, Doug, this was a very good conversation, and I look forward to talking about more Skinner in the future. And I'd just like to say to our audience, feel free, if there's an article that you'd like us to read and talk about, we would love to do that. We certainly are great admirers of the science of behavior or behavior analysis, and we like your feedback, and also we appreciate those people who are leaving us positive reviews on places like Apple, iTunes. So thank you for that, and thank you all for joining us today on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.